Coming in at number 15 is the Halo series. Now, I feel really ashamed at the fact that I've never played a Halo game. And I think this was because I was such a huge fan of first-person shooters already, with video games like Battlefield, Call of Duty, and Medal of Honor. Now, I was in university when the original Xbox was released, and I can tell you I really don't know where Microsoft would be had it not been for Bungie Studios and the original Halo. I mean, this series single-handedly raised the bar for first-person shooters. Not only did you have these impressive graphics, but you also had things like online multiplayer, vehicles, all these weapons to choose from. It really is the quintessential FPS game, and with the recent release of Halo Anniversary Edition, I can't wait to play at least through the first-player campaigns of all of these games. Coming in at number 14 is Prototype, and I can tell you that this game is definitely the most recent entry on this list. After the infamous PlayStation hack of 2011, I got Infamous for free on my system, and I finally got around to playing it earlier this year. So, the real reason why I haven't touched Prototype is because both games are remarkably similar. Really, I think this was just one giant coincidence from both developers, but I've only heard good things about the original Prototype. Not only do you have this giant open world to explore, but you have an insane amount of supernatural abilities to use at your disposal. Whether that means taking full possession of an enemy soldier or taking down a helicopter with your giant mutant arms. Really, I think this game managed to set itself from the pack, and it looks like a really enjoyable experience, one that I hope to play in the near future. Coming in at number 13 is Prince of Persia: The Sands of Time. You know, I remember when the game was first released and I went over to my friend's house to first play it, and I was blown away by the fact that you could reverse time, even though it was only for a maximum of about 5 seconds. And really, it's nothing personal against the other 2 or 3 games that have been made since The Sands of Time, but it's just that first game was so iconic, and to pass up an opportunity to play it would be doing it such a disservice. Coming in at entry number 12 is Silent Hill 1 and 2. Now, if you were to ask people what was the best horror game that you've ever played, I think a lot of them would say the first 2 entries in the Silent Hill series. I know there are those naysayers out there that'll tell you, oh, Resident Evil is scarier, but notice that I didn't say which horror game is scariest. I said which one is better. Well, let's just get this out of the way. I've played most of the Resident Evil games in the series, so they're not going to be on this list. I think Resident Evil relied a lot more on jump scares, and Silent Hill was just a much more psychological game. It really got into your head when you were playing it. You know, I remember being about 12 or 13, and I went over to a friend's house, and we stayed up the whole night playing through Silent Hill 2. Well, he played, I just watched. And I remember the first time that I saw Pyramid Head, and I think I just pissed my pants right then and there. You know, one of the things that the Silent Hill series does to make it scarier is its reliance on melee combat as opposed to guns, and I think when you're using a crowbar or a plank of wood to kill an enemy, it is a lot more terrifying than just shooting it at the barrel of a gun. And again, this is another example of 2 games that have recently gotten an HD remake on the PS3, and I never played them simply because they were too scary, but I will get around to them seeing as how they're so iconic in the scope of video games as a whole. Coming in at number 11 is the Sly Cooper series. Now, if you grew up in the days of the PS2, you know there were 3 big players in terms of platform gaming. You had Jak and Daxter, you had Ratchet and Clank, and you had the Sly Cooper series. Now, I've played all the games in the Jak and Daxter series, I've played all the games in the Ratchet and Clank series at the time, and I think really the market was just oversaturated with these types of games, so I just never got around to playing Sly Cooper. Which is such a shame, because if the guys at Sucker Punch did half as good a job with the Sly Cooper series as they did with Infamous, then these games are going to be really amazing. One of the things that made this game really stand out was its reliance on missions and mission objectives rather than just straight up platforming. You know, you didn't just have this massive sprawling world and your objective was to get from point A to point B. You had tasks you had to complete, you had enemies you had to take down, you had bosses you had to fight. You know, the guys at Sucker Punch and Sony have released an HD remake of the first 3 Sly Cooper games in preparation for the 4th one being released, and I can't wait to go to my local video game store and buying it for myself. Coming in at number 10 is Eternal Darkness: Sanity's Requiem. And like the first 2 Silent Hill games, this game is definitely one of the best psychological horror games ever developed. One of the best mechanics in this game is the fact that you have this sanity meter, and if it gets too low, really weird shit starts to happen on screen. Your controls become reversed, flies start appearing on the screen. You could start walking into the floor at any given moment. You could appear with no head. You could have a corrupt game file when in fact the file is perfectly fine. And you can always get the dreaded blue screen of death at any given moment. But unlike the Silent Hill series, this is one example where I've made it through more than half of the game and I just never got around to finishing it. Which is a pity because this is in fact one of the best games created for the GameCube by a third-party developer. It was weird, it was innovative, it was scary, and I'm looking forward to playing it down the line. Coming in at number 9 is the Metal Gear Solid series, with the exception of Metal Gear Solid 4 Guns of the Patriots, which I have completed. And I'm really regretting starting this series with Guns of the Patriots because if you go from the best of the series and you start going backwards, you might nitpick at the fact that the earlier games might not have a specific game mechanic. For instance, in Snake Eater, you have to constantly eat in order to replenish your stamina and health. And you also have to manually change your camouflage in order to be seen and unseen. But if you want to talk about a video game series that went against the grain and was years ahead of its time, then look no further than the Metal Gear Solid series. You know, you've got this great character, Solid Snake, who helms much of the series, and, you know, he's just thrust in the middle of these world politics and conspiracy theories, and he really doesn't know how to handle the situation just like you do when you're playing the game. You know, these games are definitely the best stealth games ever created, and because of that, many other developers have tried to copy its gameplay, but have ultimately failed in its execution. You had these larger-than-life characters and these larger-than-life plots, and you really felt like your choices and your actions ultimately affected the final outcome of the game. Now, I will eventually go on to complete these games in the future, but I gotta be honest with you, they're really low on my priorities list, so as to when I'll complete them, that's a whole other story altogether. Coming in at number 8 is Mass Effect 2 and 3. Now, you have to give me a little credit on this one. I have finished the original Mass Effect, but I have heard extremely good things about the other two parts in the trilogy. Now, I'm not going to lie to you, I have watched how this series ends simply because I was reading about just how bad this ending was from players and fans. But despite that ending that just got horribly trashed, the final two games in the series are really impressive. It is not only some of the best storytelling we've seen in video games, but ultimately some of the best science fiction we've seen in video games. You know, with each game that BioWare puts out, they just manage to get it every time. And with the exception of that horrendous ending, I'm still looking forward to playing the other two games in the Mass Effect series. Now, coming in at number 7 is both Shadow of the Colossus and Aiko. Now, I know I'm kind of cheating with this one, but because they're made by the same developers, a lot of people see Shadow of the Colossus as a spiritual successor to Aiko. You know, both of these games have been made with the theory in mind that less is more. Not only do they have these sweeping visuals and musical scores, but they also have this kind of minimalistic gameplay that really tries to evoke an emotion in the player. Now, I remember back in the day when I first saw Shadow of the Colossus, and I was just in awe at these monolithic creatures that you had to ultimately take down. You know, if you ever wanted to classify video games as art, these two games are just prime examples of that. And you knew when you were playing them that you were playing something unique and different that would be an instant classic in the years to come. You know, I've always wanted to play these games, especially before the release of The Last Guardian, whenever it will come out. Now, I'm going to upset a lot of people by saying this, but to date, I have not completed a Metroid game. So coming in at number 6 is the entire Metroid series, with the possible exception of the other M. In fact, the only game that I have played through most of is Metroid Prime for the GameCube. And really I have no explanation for why I haven't touched these games, especially the original Metroid for the NES and Super Metroid for the SNES. One of the reasons I never finished Metroid Prime on the GameCube is that it requires a lot of backtracking, and as anyone knows who's played any game in the Metroid series, that backtracking is essentially a huge part of the gameplay. I mean, you have Samus, who, again, is one of the all-time iconic characters in video game history, and I always found it funny how she always had to find an excuse to lose her weapons at the beginning of every game. I've heard that the Metroid games are challenging, but maybe these guys are just seeing them through the nostalgic eyes of their childhood. Nevertheless, I've always regretted not completing the Metroid series, and I hope to do so in the near future. Now, with these next 4 entries, I'm probably going to disappoint a lot of you because I simply don't know that much about them. See, growing up, I wasn't a fan of RPGs at all. In fact, the only RPG that I've ever played and successfully finished was Super Mario RPG Legend of the Seven Stars. I don't know what it was. Maybe as a kid growing up with the Super Nintendo, I was really intimidated by this new style called RPGs, and as a result, I just didn't play any of them. Instead of killing an enemy by jumping on it, you instead had hit points and stats and magic. With that being said, coming in at number 5 is Secret of Mana and Illusions of Gaia. And I'm really cheating with this entry because I always assumed that these 2 games were from the same company. So you can imagine my surprise after doing later research to find out that one was made by Square and one was made by Enix. But because they were so similar in the sense that they were RPGs that sorta kinda went against what JRPGs were at the time, I decided to just keep them together as a whole. And following that list, coming in at number 4 is Earthbound. Now fortunately, I do know a little more about this game as opposed to Secret of Mana and Illusions of Gaia. What made this game so unique was when many Japanese RPGs at the time were being released, they often took place in these giant fantastical fantasy worlds, and the thing about Earthbound is it takes place in an American city, which was really weird because this game was imported from Japan. This game is also very popular for having a lot of pop culture references within the game, and a lot of allusions to other video games at the time. But like the games in the previous entry, I know very little about it, and I'm so looking forward to eventually playing it once I get around to it. And coming in at number 3 is 2 of probably the best games ever created, and that is Chrono Cross and Chrono Trigger. Now, one of the things I do know about these games is that one deals with alternate realities or parallel universes, and the other one deals with time manipulation. And it's really a shame I never got around to playing either of them, seeing as how both are 2 of the best video games ever created. And with that in mind, coming in at number 2 is the Final Fantasy series. Again, this is going to piss off a lot of people, but I have not completed a single Final Fantasy game. Now, when I say Final Fantasy, I'm talking about more numbers 3, 6, 7, 8, and Tactics, as opposed to 10, 11, 10-2, and Final Fantasy 12. I mean, I remember growing up when Final Fantasy 7 was first released. I think it came in like 3 or 4 discs, and even though I never played it at the time, I really did understand the impact it had on video games as a whole. I will get around to it, especially since, again, Sony has recently released them on the PS3 and for the PC, so I really look forward to playing each of these games, and God knows how many hours it'll take to complete them. And finally, coming in at number 1, and this might anger some people, is the Zelda series. Now, the only Zelda game that I've successfully played and finished is Legend of Zelda: Ocarina of Time. And I gotta tell you, it was one of the best video game experiences of my life. I suppose I'm talking more about Zelda, Zelda 2, A Link to the Past, and Majora's Mask, as opposed to Twilight Princess, Wind Waker, and Skyward Sword. I mean, I don't think there's any denying the impact that this series has had, not just on video games, but on the fantasy genre as a whole. Some people see Link as this sissy in green tights and a hat, but really he stands for all the themes of the game, which is courage, bravery, heroism, and fighting good over evil. It's one of the longest running franchises in Nintendo's history, and I think it's one of the most endearing of them all. I think these games have aged incredibly well, even though some of them are more than 20 years old. So there you have it, the top 30 games that I most regret not completing. Now I want to hear what you have to say. Do you agree with my list? Do you disagree with it? Do you have a list of video games that you regret not completing? Feel free to post a comment in the comment section below. That being said, I look forward to seeing you guys in my next video. Thanks for watching. As always, feel free to rate, comment, and subscribe to my channel.